panel going. Thank you all very much. Now, if I can introduce my next speaker, it's Professor Dylan Jones-Evans. If I start by saying he too lives in Cardiff. He is Professor of Entrepreneurship and Strategy at Bristol Business School at the University of West England. He has been Special Advisor to the House of Commons Select Committee on Welsh Affairs, member of boards of Finance Wales, Institute of Welsh Affairs and IOD in Wales, trustee of Crime Cymru, one of the Prince of Wales's charities. He served as chairman of the Welsh Conservatives Economic Commission, sits on the Business Advisory Panel for the Secretary of State for Wales, and the only person to write a weekly column in the Western Mail and Daily Post. Two main newspapers in Wales. Professor Dylan, thank you.
Thank you very much. This is quite interesting for me because I don't expect to approach this conversation about the LDP from either being a politician or a planner, but actually trying to look at it from my own sort of background as Professor of Entrepreneurship Strategy and Regional Development. And the first thing that I'd really like to focus on is what is the vision for the LDP? What is the vision for Cardiff? Because I think that's the main point that Cardiff Council has to consider before it actually adopts this particular plan. So what is the economic vision for the city? Now, I don't know how many of you have actually read the 104-page LDP. I did it over the weekend, which sort of was an interesting experience. And actually within it, it actually says that the Cardiff, it does have a vision. There's 7 key strategic objectives. And one focuses on Cardiff having a thriving and prosperous economy, which will, and I quote, build strong futures for children and young people by focusing on education, training and employment opportunities, improve opportunity for the creation of quality and sustainable employment, and finally create an environment that develops, attracts and retains skilled workers, businesses and entrepreneurs to Cardiff. But the problem is, when you read it, you don't get the sense that there's any detail that helps achieve any of these worthwhile objectives. More importantly, that there's any link to any coherent economic strategy for the city that will guide its development over the next decade or more. And of course, it's all well and good to say that this plan will create 40,000 jobs, but where and how? The LDP doesn't even give us any direction on that. So is this, when you read it, it's like it's yet again adopting what most local authorities do, which is this field of dreams, if you build it, they will come, sort of approach to economic development based on past projections that may have little relevance at all to the economic landscape going forward. So I thought I'd look at this quite differently and think about how the LDP should think of how that can work around an economic strategy rather than having an economic strategy that actually works around an LDP. But what should a strategy like that look at and what should an LDP focus on? So, as I said, I appreciate and understand the continuing sort of focus on bringing greater inward investment into the city. And we've got the attractions of the new enterprise zone, and the excellent work already done by Financial Professional Services Sector panel to try and bring businesses into Cardiff. But the issue there is that the LDP seems to be entirely focused just on that, just on actually bringing more inward investment into the city. And I think that's quite different to what seems to be happening in the rest of the world. Probably made some good points about what's happening in other cities. What you tend to find when you look very carefully at what's happening as a city level and a state level across the world, that the focus has moved away from this competition between regions to attract businesses to that particular city region, to the city, to the region as a whole, to actually trying to develop its own indigenous business potential. One of the most fascinating reports that I actually read over the last 2 years actually came from the USA, which is very odd, because it was very much an economic development driver in terms of how states in particular should develop. And this applies to both city regions and cities at the same time. It was written by, I'm sure you've never heard of this, because I hadn't until I've seen the report, the National Governors Association, which is the only time the Democrats and Republicans actually work together to actually try and achieve something in the US. And it was called Growing State Economies. And what it really focused on was what sort of strategy you could have, rather than having all the states compete against each other, to actually try and develop their economies by offering different tax breaks to bring sort of companies in. That how could you develop the entrepreneurial potential of different states? And it was about identifying the innovation, the enterprise, and the strategic assets of a particular state or a city, and how then you develop a policy around that. The question is, have you ever heard about something like that actually coming out of County Hall any time during the last 20 to 30 years? And what we see about the economy at the moment is that we've gone through probably the worst recession since the 1920s. It's large firms that have shed the majority of jobs during that period. And we see every single research study shows that the majority of new jobs, either in a recession or in a growth period, are created by businesses less than 5 years old. And the question is, we're going to create 40,000 jobs within Cardiff, according to the LDP. Has the LDP looked at how it will create a strategy for encouraging such businesses? So if small firms, if new firms are going to be creating those jobs, what is the LDP telling us it will do to encourage that? To actually set up an environment in which such businesses can thrive? Because the Council's own figures show that Cardiff has one of the lowest rates of new business starts, and has one of the lowest rates of actual business density anywhere in the UK. So if you look at the document, I said I did read it, you could argue there is some commitment to entrepreneurship. It's mentioned 3 times in 104 pages. So if Cardiff is going to reach its full potential, then I believe that we must focus on developing indigenous businesses, and that must be at the heart of that particular economic policy. The question is, of course, how should the LDP reflect such a strategy? Because you could argue, after reading from cover to cover, that it currently doesn't. I'd like to see, for example, how Cardiff Council can develop an ecosystem which brings people together. You know, it's one of the most important things that a local, city or regional government can do, is to encourage business growth and business development, because it creates jobs, it raises living standards, and especially with more deprived communities. And again, Cardiff Council has not looked at this in any real depth. And what we have here is an LDP effectively that is isolated from the reality of where the new jobs are going to come from and how those jobs are going to be developed. So what I'd like to see, the discussion potentially tonight, is, you know, what aspects of the LDP you feel should reflect such an approach. You know, we talk about creating a physical and economic environment that develops, attracts and retains skilled workers, businesses and entrepreneurs to Cardiff. But how is he going to do that? We talk about inward investments being important, but we also see the development of new companies in fast-growing sectors as critical to growth. You look at cities such as Helsinki, Hong Kong, New York, San Francisco, and, yes, Colorado, Boulder in Colorado, a city of 100,000 people that is now the most entrepreneurial city in the world. What can we learn from them, and what are they doing differently? Because if we're going to focus on developing a high-skilled workforce, we have 3 universities, we have particular sectors, but there's nothing in the LDP that says how it is going to aid and support the development of those particular industries. One of the things that's come through very clearly is that we talk about the industrial developments on either side of the city, and yet if you look at how an entrepreneurial community develops, and has developed over the last 5 years since the recession, it's through things like incubators, accelerators, smaller business parks, usually located around places like universities. There's very little within this particular plan that actually gives me confidence that such businesses will thrive and grow in Cardiff under the current conditions. So hopefully, perhaps some of tonight's discussion afterwards will be devoted not necessarily to the LDP, but really what's needed to drive Cardiff forward as a city of the future. And actually, it's not whether the LDP itself is fit for purpose, but whether the overall economic strategy it purports to support is actually fit for purpose for Cardiff in the future. Diolch yn fawr.